Welcome to Stoughton Spotlight. I'm your host, Jeffrey Pickette. We're bringing you a special series called Conversations with the Candidates, where we'll be interviewing all of the candidates running for the Board of Selectmen and the School Committee. There are 4 candidates for Selectmen and 2 candidates for School Committee. And on this episode, I'm joined by one of the candidates for the School Committee, Molly Cochran. Molly, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks again, and wanted to give you an opportunity, and all of the candidates an opportunity, to express why you're running and your goals and some of the platforms in which you'll be basing your candidacy on and the issues of the day that you'd like to discuss. So let's just get started, though. For anybody who might not know Molly Cochran, introduce yourself to the Stoughton community.
Thank you. And again, I do appreciate the opportunity to be here and be able to introduce myself to the people of Stoughton. I've been a Stoughton resident, I believe, since August of 2004, when my children were going into kindergarten. I have 15-year-old twins who have been at the Stoughton school system and are now in Stoughton High School. Prior to that, I lived in Milton for several years. I am an attorney. I'm in private practice. I'm a litigation attorney. I practice in Wellesley. I've been there with the firm, or actually a series of firms, for over 10 years. And that is my essential background.
And so, what made you want to run for school committee?
I have long been interested in school committee. I am very interested in education and educational issues. I'm very passionate about public education and the importance to the community and to democracy as a whole to have a really excellent public education system. I first expressed interest in the school committee about 4.5 years ago, when somebody who was on the school committee then got indicted. I was alarmed at that development and thought that perhaps it's important for people to become more involved so we have a better quality of school committee. So at that time, I actually applied for the position. The selectmen interviewed various candidates and did not select me, but a couple of people certainly encouraged me to try to stay involved. And I'm running for school committee this year because I both believe that I have, the time to commit to this undertaking, which is a very significant commitment of time, and I believe that I can make a positive contribution to the school committee.
And have you had a chance to watch the various meetings and see the school committee meetings over the years? Specifically over the past year, what's your take on the discourse at the school committee meetings?
My take on it is that there's a lot of tension and conflict and discord, and there's perhaps some inefficient use of time. The agendas and the things that happen during the course of the meeting don't always seem to make a lot of sense or be productive. The interaction with the school administration does not always seem to be collaborative, productive, aimed at something that's going to be achieved by those interactions, or even sometimes respectful. So I have felt some concern over what I've seen and felt that that's perhaps not the best way for the school committee to operate as far as achieving what should be everybody's joint goal, the goal of everybody who's got a child in schools, or for every single member of the community, is to have an excellent school system. And if that's the goal, what happens at those meetings should really always reflect that goal, as opposed to somebody else, as opposed to another agenda.
So how could you work to change that if that's how you feel the school committee's meetings have been going?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's important to establish respectful, collaborative relationships with everybody on the school committee and with the superintendent and with everybody in the administration of the schools, all the way down to the principals. It's important, of course, to be very educated about the issues, to do your background research, to do that efficiently and off camera, to read your educational packets, or I should say your school committee packets, to obtain the underlying information, to do whatever research you need to do, so that you're very well informed, prepared to have a productive meeting at the school committee. I think it's important to realize the necessity that the school committee and the schools as a whole have to interact within the greater town, that we don't want to be in conflict with town officials. We don't want to be in conflict with, whether it's on budgetary issues or other issues. We all are all part of the same community. We should have the same objectives to have, obviously, a very well-run town and an efficient town, and a very well-run and excellent school system.
Well, that's definitely, you kind of touched upon the difference with the school and the town side, and there's often been the discussion of the two ends of Pearl Street. You know, you have 232 Pearl Street and you have 10 Pearl Street, 10 Pearl Street being the town hall, 232 being the school administration wing. How do you feel that the discourse between the two has improved, or do you feel that there's still work that needs to be done in terms of collaborating together?
My understanding is that the discourse and the interaction has improved since Mr. Hartman has come on as town manager, and that there is a productive relationship between him and Dr. Rizzi. I think that was a key. It was key, I think, to have a very professional and efficient town manager. I was actually on the town manager search committee in 2012. I was among the committee members who interviewed Mr. Hartman and selected him, and I believe a couple of other candidates for the Board of Selectmen's final selection. So I felt that it was important to get that in place and to professionalize that office and professionalize Town Hall. So my understanding is that there is better interaction, generally speaking, between the superintendent's office and Town Hall, and they're trying to work mutually to agree upon reasonable budgetary issues. At the same time, I don't know that the school committee as a whole is interacting well with Town Hall as a whole, and that would be something that I would think would be a forefront of my platform and my agenda, is to, as a member of the school committee, to help the school committee as a whole form productive relationships and not have people, distrustful of each other or in conflict.
And you mentioned the budget, and the budget, it seems every year the budget's roughly a 5% increase from the year before. Do you feel that this is something that the town, especially where it's looking to potentially add many large capital projects down the road, do you think this is something that the town can continue to afford, is increasing its largest portion of the budget by more than the 2.5%, which is afforded by Prop 2.5?
Exactly. I think it's one of the most challenging issues that the school committee will have to face, obviously, is the budget and how we can keep the Stoughton school system on a track to being an excellent school system that provides opportunities for every child from every background. I think that's the key to a healthy and desirable community, to have an excellent school system. So we all have to keep that in mind. At the same time, I absolutely realize that there will be non-school related capital improvements and other issues that need to be addressed. We certainly all know that the downtown is depressed, and I think the actual official term under the Massachusetts law is it's decadent, and it is disheartening to see that downtown and to see the empty storefronts. And I think that's also a key part of the community's reputation and attracting good people to the community and keeping them in the community. So I think people have to keep in mind that whether it's going to have to be, whether we can increase the budget by the way it's being increased for the schools in the last couple of years. In the future years, I think is perhaps uncertain, but we all have to keep the goal in mind that we need to spend money on the schools when we really need to continue to have an excellent school system.
Looking at this proposed budget that was voted on by the school committee, of course, the finance committee and ultimately town meeting has the final say. Is there anything in that budget that if you were on the school committee to craft this budget, you might have done differently, you might have voted on differently, you would have liked to have seen done that wasn't done?
That's a very good question. And I don't think I can answer that in the abstract. I mean, I have seen the budget, I'm familiar with it, but have not, certainly was not present for all the underlying discussions as to each of the line items. I know that the school committee did go through some of those line items. Some of them were questioned. There were some reductions suggested by a member of the school committee, which certainly he's entitled to do that and to go through that line item by line item. I think on a lot of those, however, there were responses by the superintendent and other school committee members as to why that, what the basis was for that. So nothing jumped out at me as something that really was unsupportable in that budget. I think it was carefully drawn up, and I think, given the budget system, which it does come from the principals on up to the superintendent's office, there is a complex, multi-layered process, and before you question some of that, you should have a reason for questioning that. And so I don't have a particular line item, particular section that I feel was improperly budgeted.
Well, I'll go back to 3 positions from the previous year's budget that have seemed to taken up much of the discussion this year, and those are Unit B positions in the school budget, a couple of curriculum coordinators, and a dean of discipline at the high school. What's your take on this situation? If you were on the school committee, how would you have voted to? Would you have liked to have seen these positions instituted? You know, they still haven't been yet.
Yes, and it's troublesome to me that there has been so much back and forth on the issue of filling these 3 Unit B positions. I thought that at the school committee meetings that a compelling case was made for filling those positions, the curriculum coordinators, especially given the new teacher evaluation requirements that are legally mandated that seem to be, quite frankly, pretty onerous, and especially given that there are some curriculum changes given the, switching from MCAS to PARCC testing, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that there was a compelling case made for those as being necessary administrative positions. And it's unfortunate that there has been so much conflict and back and forth about whether they would be funded or not funded. And I think fundamentally, while keeping obviously a strict eye on the budget and keeping in mind the limitations of the budget, the school committee should be open-minded to listening to what the superintendent articulates as necessary for the administration of the schools. So open-minded doesn't mean that you don't question it, that you don't perhaps find some things unaffordable, but I felt that some members of the committee were perhaps, for reasons that were really not articulated, not even open to seriously considering filling those positions. And it's also my understanding from talking to one of the principals that those positions, they've been trying to fill those for multiple years. And that because of budgetary problems in the past, they've been delaying that. And this was the year they felt that they had the money. And yes, I do support those positions being filled.
Now those positions becoming, let's say, politicized in a sense, and
Yes.
that is with the recent news of the consulting group that the superintendent has formed. And while we're filming this is still we don't know much publicly. This is still being discussed a lot in executive session by the school committee. But just knowing what we know now, what's your take on the Level 1 Associates, the consulting group that the superintendent has formed, which includes many of her administrative peers in the Stoughton public school system?
My general reaction is that, let me back up. It's my understanding that the superintendent's contract and the deputy superintendent's contract both allow for consulting outside of the school system. I would generally not be a big fan of that, but if that's what they negotiated and that's what the school committee agreed to, that's their right to do that within whatever limitations are in the contracts. That being said, I think it could prove a distraction, and I think here it has proved an unfortunate distraction. And I don't want to read into what's present on the website any more than what's there. I know that the school committee is addressing it, and it's proper for the school committee to ask questions about that and to make sure that that's not interfering with the administration of the schools and interfering with those relationships. Now, I will say, as a legal matter, it's not against the law for somebody who is in a company who decides to perhaps form another company to talk with their fellow employees and associates about, and make plans, quite frankly, that after we leave this company, we're going to form a different company, even if it's in competition. Now, here we're not talking about competition, but so it's not inappropriate. The law generally would not look at it as inappropriate to have discussions with with people you supervise or people you work with about maybe someday we'll do this together. But the question is, when is it going to be done? How is it going to be done? I think it's really a red herring to say that that has anything to do with the funding of the Unit B positions, which again, other than the fact that it is a budgetary matter and it does cost money, I don't really understand the opposition to it. And I don't really understand whether there's a legitimate and a well-reasoned opposition to it.
Now, kind of continuing with the politicized nature of what the campaigns can be and just the school committee in general. Last year's campaign, really for both selectmen and school committee, really seemed to be, it became a contract issue. Contracts were the dominant topic, and it became clear as each debate went on, that the contracts were going to be the issue that decided the election. They've been settled on the school side now, but do you still feel that that could kind of creep into play here this election cycle, or do you feel it's done with and we're moving on?
Well, I mean, obviously it's done with. We will abide by the contract, and I don't think there's any need to rehash the impassioned feelings that were on both sides. I don't really plan to make it a campaign issue. I do think it was unfortunate that it was so politicized and that there was such a prolonged contract dispute and so many hard feelings on either side. I would only say going forward that if I were ever involved in future collective bargaining negotiations, that I would be cautious in my approach, that I would be fair-minded, with all the respect in the world for the teachers and what they have accomplished and how much we need them. I would also make sure that any step that I would take involved in collective bargaining negotiations was, with the general consent, or at least discussion before with the entire committee and with council for the school committee, being who has the absolute expertise and of course the understanding and the history, being a part of those negotiations, which I think there may have been some points there where that was not followed, that general rule of advice.
So moving on to what could be the biggest story, certainly from the school side, but could be town side, coming down the line, is the new high school or potential new high school. And I'd like to get your take on that and where you kind of stand on this process and where you see it going forward.
Certainly. Well, it is a process that is underway, which I think is a good thing for the town. I have a visceral response to the question of do we need a new high school, because I've been in the high school and I've been in the IA building, and I've also been in other high schools of other towns that are in same sports leagues that we're in, and it's very disheartening to see that we have its high school in the shape that we have. And I've gone on record, I've written a letter to the school committee a couple of months ago that was just spontaneous, concern. Wouldn't be shocked to hear, Building A collapses on the heads of students someday. It really just looks so derelict. So I am concerned about that. I think we need to have a new high school or a newly renovated high school. I'm not on the school building committee, and that's not really something that directly comes before the school committee for a vote as to what to do on that. Again, that's a separate committee. That being said, it's important for whatever decision gets made by that separate committee that the school committee is 100% behind it and is working efficiently and productively through that process, which either way it turns out will be a complex process. And it's also a process that involves the state and millions of dollars being funded by the state. And I think the state has to have the confidence and trust in a very high-functioning collaborative school committee to go through that process. So I think it is important that we are ready to work with the state efficiently and productively as a, again, high-functioning school committee so that we can go through that process.
And the high school isn't the only building in Stoughton that is in need of potential replacement or improvement. Actually, in fact, that there hasn't been any new construction for a school building in over 40 years in Stoughton. That could very well be, that issue could very well peak during your tenure on the school committee. What's your overall plan or take on the conditions of the 8 buildings in the Stoughton Public Schools and how to address the long-term needs? I know that there's talk of a statement of interest as we're taping this for the South Elementary School and either renovating or replacing that school, but I'm talking just overall with all, again, none of these buildings have been built in any way, shape, or form in the near past. It's all 40 plus years old.
Right.
So.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that with so many buildings so old, clearly there's a lot of maintenance costs that are always going to be part of the budget. And I think it's with respect to the high school, which is the extreme example, there's a certain point at which if you keep throwing money into an old building like you keep throwing money into an old car, you're not spending your money wisely. That being said, I think we have to take things one step at a time. And yes, maybe it makes sense to have a long-term plan looking at after the high school is addressed, what might be next, how much is it going to cost, what might be the long-term plan. Because you're right, we don't want to be faced with a case when 10 years from now we have 3 elementary schools that are really at the point of collapse. So we need to not necessarily increase in the short run beyond the high school the money that we're going to spend, and I know South School is actually on the list too. But keep in mind that we should have that issue on our long-term plan, whether it's 10 years or more, being realistic as well, that we're certainly not at the point where we're going to be just going from one project immediately to another, because we do have our financial limitations. I don't see anything, not familiar with the South School, the interior, I don't see anything drastically wrong with the other schools as far as them being useful and productive buildings for people to be in.
Do you feel that pursuing the South School project potentially at the same time as the high school project do you feel that might be a mistake of trying to hedge your bets, or do you feel that they're completely different issues?
Well, they clearly overlap because they are enormous projects and they are capital projects that have to be funded. So I think that it might be unrealistic to literally be under construction with 2 schools at the same time, which doesn't mean that if the high school issue is properly addressed and the process goes on to the next phase, that it's not time to look seriously at the next most immediate need and examine that. But I don't necessarily see those things going, to being built simultaneously at the same time. That might be unrealistic. So again, we have to be realistic as to how much the town can absorb and what's going to fit within the budget.
So we're approaching roughly 5 minutes to go with our conversation. Like I said, this half hour really does fly by. What do you view as the most important issue that you face as a school committee member, potential school committee member? What's the most important issue that you will face if you are elected?
That's an excellent question. I think the most important issue will ensuring that everyone in the town, and most importantly, the families who have children in the school system, feel very confident about their school committee and feel that the school committee is receptive to them, is listening to them, is making the right policy decisions, is on the one hand supporting the teachers, but also trying to work within an overall administrative budget at the same time, and is being careful of the taxpayers' money. And that's obviously requires a lot of judgment and discretion and balancing of interests and compromise. I mean, we will have to compromise, the superintendent will have to compromise, and at the end of the day, the union will have to compromise. That's the only way the system is going to work.
Now, transparency is an issue that often gets brought up during campaigns. Do you feel the current school committee is transparent?
That's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, the hearings themselves are public and can be viewed by anybody. The minutes are available to be viewed by anybody. I know that the committee does go into executive session, but there's a reason that it goes into executive session. I'm not sure I have any specific qualms with how recently the school committee has been operated as far as transparency. There may have been issues with respect to the collective bargaining agreement and things that transpired. And again, those are negotiations that are behind closed doors that should have been handled differently, and perhaps there should have been more transparency or more discussion about that. But I wasn't at the table then, and I don't want to.
Are you specifically talking about the contract or different issues?
Well, I would say the contract itself, and some decisions that were made and some offers that were made.
Now, what about the administration? I'll ask the same question to be fair. Do you feel the administration is as transparent as it can be?
That's a good question. Again, I'm not aware of any issues that jump out at me as far as being transparent. I think the administration answers the questions at the open meetings, I think, and lays out the information, makes itself available, and should make itself available for individual meetings with one or more school committee members, just so they can get a deeper level of background in whatever the budgetary or other issue may be. I'm not aware of any issues with withholding information. I feel like when I listen to Dr. Rizzi at the meetings, I understand what she's talking about, that she's being responsive. But that is critical, obviously, that not only the school committee members feel like that the administration and the superintendent is being transparent, but the public feels that as well.
And Do you feel, this might be a tough question just given that you're not on the committee, but if you could give a brief evaluation of what you've seen from the superintendent, because that is one of the jobs as a school committee member, is to evaluate the executive of the schools, and that would be the superintendent. So what have you seen from the superintendent?
I think my judgment is impacted by two things. My children have gone to the schools for over 10 years. It is a well-run school system. The high school is a well-run high school. So I'm very much impacted by what I've seen, and obviously that's a commentary on the quality of the teachers that we have and the quality of the principals at all of those schools. So I get a sense that this is not a school system in chaos. It's not out of control. It's meeting many of its goals. It's obviously managed to achieve level 1 status for the majority of its schools, and that's not something to be taken lightly. If I had to do an evaluation, I think that Dr. Rizzi maybe needs to work on more of her relationships with the teachers or the teachers union, but again, I don't really know the history of how, because I know it's not a warm relationship. I don't really know the history of how maybe the feelings on either side came about. I think you'd have to have been there at the collective bargaining table for a couple of rounds of collective bargaining to see why the parties are the way they are.
And before we get into a rapid fire segment, just to end the conversation, what's a curriculum-based item that you would like to see the schools pursue over the next couple of years?
Well, this is completely biased again, but if I would love for there to be more writing in the school system, more, starting in elementary school all the way up. I would like there just to be more writing assigned, more writing that the students have to do from day one, and longer written reports in middle school and high school. I think you just can't write too much. I say that in as a lawyer, I write all the time. I write legal briefs. I feel like it's a hard thing to learn, and it takes years and years and years of sitting down and trying to write an essay and trying to write paragraphs and things. So that was a long answer, but I'm very much an advocate of a lot of writing.
And now to get to some rapid fire questions. Best spot to relax in Stoughton?
Best spot to relax? I like the House of Brews for like morning tea or coffee.
Best spot to eat in Stoughton?
Zachary's for breakfast.
Word association. Stoughton.
Hometown.
Stoughton schools.
Good schools.
Molly Cochran.
Attorney.
And just as a quick question to wrap up, first thing you do on the school committee if you're elected?
I actually would like to sit down and meet one-on-one with all the school committee members and try to establish a positive relationship. And I would like to do the same thing with the superintendent and the deputy superintendent. And actually, going on, and also I would say the individual principals, I would like to sort of sit down with them one-on-one.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Jeffrey Pickette, host of Stoughton Spotlight. Just a final reminder, Election Day is Tuesday, April 7th. Thanks again for tuning in.